The rain fell relentlessly on the city, an endless curtain of drops drumming against the windows of Ethan Davis's car. Through the fogged windshield, he could see the imposing glass tower that housed the heart of his business empire. The pulse of traffic barely reached him, muffled by the constant drumming of water on the metal of the vehicle. With each passing second, the building seemed further away, more unreachable. And for the first time in his life, he felt on the verge of losing it all. Ethan, a man who for decades had maintained a fierce composure, now found himself at his lowest point. His pale, sallow skin was a faithful reflection of the silent battle he waged against an illness that weakened him faster than he could bear. His once steady hands trembled slightly as he caressed the back of the seat. The clock read 10:25 a.m. The meeting was set for 11 o'clock, but what weighed on him most wasn't the proximity of the hour, it was the crushing sense that his company wasn't the only thing at stake that morning. What he feared losing most was the image of himself that he had built through years of sacrifice, the image of an invincible man, always in control, always one step ahead. Emily, sitting in the passenger seat, watched him out of the corner of her eye. She had been with Ethan for the past few months, first as his private nurse, but her role had unexpectedly grown. She took care of him, yes, managing the medications he needed to take and monitoring the symptoms of his illness. But her true importance had evolved beyond the clinical, she was the only person who truly knew the depths of his struggle. Ethan had learned to trust her in a way he had never allowed with anyone else. She was his only emotional anchor. "Are you feeling okay?" Emily asked softly, knowing the answer wouldn't be affirmative. But she knew she had to ask, to offer him a way out, even if only momentarily. Ethan didn't respond right away. His eyes remained fixed on the building. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the tightness in his chest, but it felt as though each breath only brought more weight down on him. After a few seconds, his voice came out hoarse, as if speaking took more energy than he had available. "I'm fine as one can be," he murmured, without taking his eyes off the horizon. The words hung in the air with an irony they both understood. Emily glanced down at her wristwatch. 30 minutes remained until the meeting, a meeting she knew would mark a before and after for Ethan. It wasn't just a business gathering, it was a trial. The company's board had grown restless in recent weeks, and Ryan Brooks, Ethan's trusted partner for years, had been pushing ideas that threatened the stability of everything Ethan had built. Emily had watched Ryan operate from the shadows, offering subtle suggestions that, at first glance, seemed harmless but hid a dangerous ambition. What Ethan didn't yet know was that his greatest threat didn't come from the outside, but from someone he trusted. "You know you don't have to do this today, right?" Emily said gently. She knew it was a futile question, but felt the need to remind him that he had a choice. A pause, a break. Something to ease the burden on his shoulders. Ethan slowly turned his head toward her, and for a moment, his blue eyes met hers. There was something in his gaze, a mixture of exhaustion and determination. That expression reminded her why he was there, why he couldn't afford to rest. The Davis Empire wasn't just a company, it was his legacy, the symbol of his ability to overcome any obstacle, to rise above any challenge. And now, even in his most fragile state, he couldn't allow himself to give up. "No. I can't. If I don't show up today, it'll be worse." His voice was low, but the firmness in his words was undeniable. Simply saying it seemed to give him some strength, as if reaffirming his decision helped him bear the heaviness in his chest. Emily nodded silently. She knew there wasn't much more she could say to convince him. Ethan was stubborn to a fault, and that was one of the reasons he had come so far. But at the same time, that stubbornness was pushing him to the brink, risking not just his company, but his life. "All right, Ethan, but remember, you're not alone in this," she said softly, trying to offer a bit of calm. She knew it wasn't a solution, but perhaps those words would provide some comfort. He gave her a faint smile, one that didn't reach his eyes, but, in some way, appreciated her effort. She was the closest thing to support he had at that moment, someone who saw him not just as the powerful man, but as a human being with fears and vulnerabilities. Finally, the car came to a stop in front of the building's entrance. Ethan looked up, watching the rain trickle down the tower's glass, distorting the image of the sky. He felt a weight in his chest, more than just the anxiety about the meeting. It was the weight of years of decisions, of sacrifices, of constantly fighting to stay at the top. "Let's go," he said, more to himself than to Emily, as he opened the door and stepped out of the car. Emily followed him, always at his side, ready to help if needed. The cold wind wrapped around them instantly, but Ethan barely noticed. His mind was already on the meeting, on what was about to happen. As they walked toward the entrance, Emily couldn't help but notice how fragile he looked. Ethan Davis, the man who had built an empire, now walked with heavy steps, as if the entire world rested on his shoulders. Yet what Emily admired about him was his ability to keep going, even when everything seemed lost. Inside the building, the silence was almost eerie. The lights shone with a coldness that contrasted with the emotional chaos Ethan felt. Beyond those doors, Ryan Brooks and the rest of the board awaited him. He knew he would have to face tough questions, decisions that could change the course of his life and his company forever. Ethan stopped in front of the elevator doors, feeling the cold metal beneath his fingers. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes for a brief moment, trying to gather strength. Emily, beside him, gave him a supportive glance, but she knew that, in the end, this battle was his. And though she would be there to help however she could, only Ethan could make the decisions that would define his future. The elevator doors opened, and with one last sigh, Ethan stepped inside. The elevator ascended slowly, a metallic hum that echoed in Ethan's mind, like a clock counting down the seconds before everything collapsed. The cold lights illuminated his pale face, casting deep shadows under his eyes. As the elevator rose, he could feel the weight of the tension accumulating in his chest. Each floor that passed brought him closer to a confrontation he wasn't sure he could handle. He took deep breaths, trying to control the dull pain pulsing in his ribs. He knew his body was at its limit, but he couldn't afford to falter. Not today. Emily, by his side, watched him with silent concern. She knew this wasn't just a business challenge for Ethan, but an internal battle between the strength that had carried him to the top and the vulnerability now consuming him. She could feel Ethan's tension as her own, and though she couldn't lighten the emotional burden he carried, she was determined to stand firm by his side. When the elevator doors opened on the 34th floor, the sight of the luxurious corridor hit him with a bitter familiarity. The plush carpet, the walls covered in modern art, and the expansive windows offering an impressive view of the city now seemed empty to him, as if the shine of his success had lost its luster. He walked slowly toward the doors of the meeting room, his steps heavier than usual. Emily followed closely, adjusting her pace to neither get ahead nor fall behind. She knew her presence gave him a sense of stability, even if he wouldn't admit it. The door to the meeting room opened automatically as they approached, revealing a large, bright space with a long glass table at the center. Around it, the board members were already seated, their faces serious and expectant. But what stood out most was the figure of Ryan Brooks, occupying the chair at the opposite end of the table. Ryan, with his immaculate gray suit and air of unbridled confidence, watched him with a restrained smile. There was something in his gaze that made Ethan's skin crawl, a sense of danger hidden beneath that friendly facade. Ethan took a moment before stepping forward to his chair at the head of the table. He could feel all the eyes in the room on him, assessing his condition, measuring his weakness. He knew there had been rumors, knew that some in that room wondered if he was still capable of leading the company in his current state. Ryan had been skillful in planting those doubts in the weeks leading up to this, always with subtle comments, never a direct accusation. Ethan had seen how Ryan's seemingly harmless words took root in the minds of others, creating an atmosphere of distrust around his leadership abilities. "Good morning," Ethan said in a firm voice, though it was slightly dulled by the effort it took. He sat down slowly in his chair, feeling the pain radiating from his back to his abdomen. Emily took a seat in a discreet corner of the room, watching silently but attentively, ready to help if Ethan needed her. Ryan was the first to speak, as if he had been waiting for this moment. With a smile that didn't reach his eyes, he leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "Ethan, it's great to see you here today. I know these days have been difficult for you. We all appreciate that you've come, especially with how crucial this meeting is for the company's future." Ethan noticed the subtext in his words. "We know you're not well, we know you're weak." Ryan was a master at disguising his attacks under a veil of genuine concern. He had done it many times before, but now, in this precise moment, it felt more threatening than ever. "Thank you, Ryan," Ethan responded, making an effort to remain composed. He wasn't going to give in to his power plays. The company was his, and even though his body was betraying him, he wouldn't allow someone like Ryan to catch him off guard. The board watched him in silence, waiting for the meeting to begin formally. Ethan knew they were all there for one reason: Ryan's proposal for aggressive expansion. Ryan had been pushing the idea of expanding the company into more risky international markets, with promises of big short-term gains. But Ethan, always more calculated, knew that those promises were full of uncertainty. It wasn't the kind of risk he was willing to take, especially with the company at such a fragile point. "All right, let's get to the matter at hand today," Ethan said, adjusting the documents in front of him. "The expansion Ryan has proposed." Ryan smiled, as if he had been waiting for this opening. "Exactly, Ethan. I've been working hard on this, and I think we can all agree that the times demand decisive action. If we don't take advantage of this opportunity, we could lose a key strategic advantage." His words resonated in the room, and several board members nodded slightly. It was clear that some were already convinced by his argument. Ethan felt a wave of exhaustion. He knew Ryan had been working behind the scenes, making sure some of the board members were on his side before the meeting. But he couldn't afford to lose his composure now. He needed to be methodical, precise. "I understand your enthusiasm, Ryan," Ethan said, trying to maintain control of the conversation, "but there are too many factors that haven't been properly considered. The volatility of those markets is high, and committing such significant resources at this time could put us in a dangerous position." Ryan tilted his head slightly, as if listening attentively, but his smile didn't fade. It was the kind of smile that said, "I've already won, even if you don't know it yet." "I understand, Ethan, but I've done extensive research. I've spoken with external analysts, and they all agree that this is the ideal time. Yes, there are risks, but the reward is more than enough to justify it." He paused strategically, looking at the other board members. "And frankly, I think this is what our company needs to regain the momentum we've lost in recent months." That last comment was a direct jab. Regain the momentum was his way of saying that the company had been stagnant under Ethan's leadership in recent months, since his illness had become apparent. The murmurs in the room confirmed what Ethan already feared. Some agreed with Ryan, at least in part. Ethan felt cold sweat forming on his forehead. The pain in his chest intensified. His vision blurred for a moment, but he closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He couldn't afford to lose control now. He felt Emily's gaze from the corner of the room, her silent support. That simple presence anchored him in some way, reminding him that he wasn't alone. "Ethan," Ryan interrupted the silence that had settled, "I know you've been through a lot lately, and we all respect what you've done for this company. But we need to be realistic about the future. We can't keep operating as we did before. It's time for a new direction." Ryan's words were a calculated blow. A new direction was a clear insinuation that Ethan was no longer fit to lead, that his time had passed. Ethan felt a wave of anger mixed with frustration. How had it come to this? Ryan, the man he had brought into the company, was now trying to undermine him in front of the entire board. Before he could respond, Emily unexpectedly spoke up. Her voice was soft but firm. "What Mr. Brooks is proposing is ambitious, yes, But I wonder if he has considered the long-term impact of making hasty decisions, especially at a time when internal stability is crucial. All eyes turned toward her, surprised that Ethan's nurse would speak up in such a delicate meeting. Ryan frowned for a second, clearly irritated by the interruption, but quickly regained his composure. "With all due respect, miss, I don't believe that," Ryan began, but Emily cut him off, maintaining her calm. "With all due respect, Mr. Brooks, I'm aware that you've done extensive research on international markets. But I've been close to Ethan long enough to know that he has always carefully considered every decision over the years. He's never been someone to act without deep analysis. My only question is, are we truly ready to take on this kind of risk without first ensuring we have the proper internal resources?" The tension in the room was palpable. Ethan, surprised by Emily's intervention, felt an odd sense of relief. She had said what he wasn't able to say at that moment, and although the board was clearly taken aback, her words resonated with logic. Ryan, on the other hand, appeared less sure. His face showed a flash of irritation before his calm expression returned. "What I'm trying to say is," Ryan started again, but the silence lingered for an uncomfortable second, and that pause was enough for Ethan to realize that, despite his weakness, he wasn't defeated. The room fell into silence after Emily's words, a silence heavy with unspoken tensions. Everyone present looked between Ethan and Ryan, waiting for the next move, the next comment that would reveal where the company's future would head. Ethan's breathing was labored, his chest rising and falling slowly, almost painfully, but his mind was racing. Ryan had laid his ambition bare, and although some members of the board seemed convinced by his plan, Emily's intervention had planted a seed of doubt. A small seed, but enough. Ryan, seated at the far end of the table, wasn't used to being questioned. The control he usually exercised in meetings, often subtly, was unraveling in front of a strength he hadn't anticipated. For months, Ryan had been meticulous, maneuvering behind the scenes to solidify his influence, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. However, Emily's intervention had been a blow that caught him by surprise. And in business, surprises are dangerous. With a tense smile, Ryan leaned forward, determined to regain control. "I appreciate the observation, Emily," he said courteously, though there was an edge to his words. "However, these decisions, of course, require a broader perspective, a strategic vision." He glanced at the other board members, seeking to reassert his control. "We all know that this company has faced immense challenges in recent months. The market has been volatile, the competition has intensified, and, well, we've had to deal with delicate internal situations." His gaze shifted toward Ethan, subtly alluding to what everyone already knew, Ethan's illness and his weakened state. Once again, Ryan played the card of his partner's fragility, seeking to plant the ultimate doubt about Ethan's ability to remain in charge. Ethan watched Ryan with a mix of exhaustion and contained fury. Every word from his partner was laden with insinuations, striking his mind like poison darts. He knew Ryan well, and he understood that this was only the prelude to something much bigger. The moment had come for Ryan to reveal his true plan, the betrayal he had been quietly orchestrating for so long. Ryan stood up with deliberate motion, walking around the table as he spoke. His voice was smooth, persuasive, and the board members followed him attentively. "We've worked hard to stay afloat, and I must say, everyone here has done an excellent job. But as you know, leadership means making tough decisions in the most critical moments. Ethan has been an exemplary leader, don't get me wrong, but in these times," he paused just behind Ethan's chair, placing a hand on the backrest, "we need fresh vision, someone who is in the right condition to make the necessary changes to secure the company's future." The tension in the room was palpable. Emily clenched her hands tightly beneath the table, never taking her eyes off Ryan. Ethan remained still, feeling the cold touch of betrayal finally revealing itself in plain view. The game had begun, and Ryan was no longer hiding his intention. "That's why I believe the board must consider a restructuring of leadership," Ryan said calmly, as though he were merely suggesting a simple adjustment. Ethan, we all have the utmost respect for what you've done for this company, but it's time we consider what is best for the company as a whole. The soft, almost compassionate tone in which he spoke disguised the true intention behind his words. Ethan felt a surge of anger and helplessness. Ryan's words, cloaked in false concern, were a direct affront. It was a low blow, not only questioning his capability but also insinuating that his time at the helm had come to an end. For a moment, Ethan considered raising his voice, confronting Ryan openly, but something stopped him. He knew that in his current state, his anger would only confirm the suspicions of weakness Ryan was planting. He needed a different strategy. Emily looked at him, reading the tension on his face, and understood that Ethan was at his breaking point. She knew the board was beginning to waver, that the balance was dangerously tipping in Ryan's favor. And at that moment, she decided to act again. "May I say something, if I may?" she said, her tone firmer this time, immediately drawing the room's attention. "I know Ethan better than many of you right now. I've been by his side for months, and I've seen his dedication to this company even in the hardest moments. I don't believe a rushed transition in leadership is the solution. This is not the time to act hastily or under external pressure." Ryan's gaze hardened, clearly irritated by her intervention. He was losing control of the narrative. "We appreciate your perspective, Emily, but this is an issue that needs to be handled at the executive level," Ryan replied, trying to regain control of the situation. Emily, however, was not intimidated. She knew she couldn't confront Ryan directly on business terms, but she could do something that Ethan couldn't in that moment: defend his integrity. Ethan, physically weakened, was a leader who had built the company through sheer effort, and that couldn't be erased by Ryan's dirty games. With quiet strength, Emily addressed the board members directly. "What we need to consider here isn't just market risk but the legacy that's been built. Ethan has been a pillar of stability and has shown the ability to manage calculated risks. This is a delicate moment for all of us, and I suggest that we don't make impulsive decisions based on emotions or perceptions of temporary weakness. We're all here to safeguard the future of the company, and that includes making thoughtful decisions, not rash reactions." The board, surprised by Emily's boldness, began murmuring among themselves. Some nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in her words. Others glanced at Ryan, waiting for his reaction. Ryan, clearly frustrated, realized that he couldn't proceed as directly as he had planned. Ethan, still processing everything that was happening, began to see the situation in a new light. Emily had shifted the course of the conversation, giving it an unexpected turn. But he knew this wasn't over. Ryan still had more cards to play, and Ethan had a gut feeling that the next move would be the definitive blow. And it didn't take long. "It seems we're divided on this issue," Ryan said, his tone colder now. "But before we make any decision, I believe it's my responsibility as a partner to bring to light some financial matters that need to be considered." His words fell like a cold splash of water. Ethan felt his heart beat faster, anticipating what was coming. During the last quarter, certain financial errors dating back several years have come to light, and I think we all have the right to know what's going on before moving forward with any decisions. Ethan's face paled even more. He knew exactly what Ryan was talking about. Years ago, during a period of rapid expansion, certain financial errors had been made, small missteps that never became public. He had corrected the course before any real damage was done, but Ryan, with his access to internal information, had unearthed those old mistakes. It was a low blow, one that Ethan hadn't seen coming with such clarity. The silence in the room was deafening. All eyes were on Ethan, waiting for his reaction, waiting for an explanation. Ryan, with a calculated smile, had ensured that Ethan was in the worst possible position. Now, any word he said could be used against him. Emily, who had been watching every move, immediately understood the gravity of the situation. She knew that if Ethan didn't take control of the narrative at that moment, Ryan would crush him. But she also knew that Ethan, in his current state, didn't have the strength to defend himself as he once would have. That's when a dangerous but necessary idea crossed her mind. She leaned toward Ethan and whispered softly, "You need to confess it. Now, before Ryan uses it against you. I know it's a risk, but if you take the initiative, you can control how the conversation unfolds." Ethan looked at her, surprised by her boldness, but deep down, he knew she was right. Ryan had set a perfect trap, but if he acted first, he could dismantle it before it fully closed in. Taking a deep breath, Ethan straightened in his seat. All eyes were still on him, and now was the moment to speak. "It's true," he began, his voice firmer than he expected. "Several years ago, during a period of rapid expansion, I made financial errors that weren't reported at the time. Mistakes that I corrected before they caused any real harm, but mistakes nonetheless. I'm not proud of it, but I'm not going to hide it either." The room erupted into murmurs, some board members looking at each other in surprise. Ryan, who had expected Ethan to remain silent, was momentarily disarmed by the confession. Ethan continued. "I made those mistakes because, at the time, I thought it was what was best for the company's future. And although I rectified them, it's something I must take responsibility for. I won't allow it to be used against me dishonestly. I'm here to be transparent, and it's that same transparency that has kept this company strong for so many years." The board, which at first seemed baffled, began to absorb Ethan's words. His sincerity, rather than weakening him as Ryan had planned, strengthened him. Ryan, frustrated by Ethan's confession, realized that his plan had partially failed. He had wanted to expose him to destroy him, but Ethan had taken control of the situation, neutralizing the attack before it could have the expected impact. Emily, watching from her place, looked at Ethan with a mix of pride and relief. He had managed to defuse the time bomb Ryan had set, and although the battle wasn't over, the tide of the war had changed. The boardroom had fallen into a tense silence after Ethan's confession. His statement had dropped like a bomb, surprising the board members, who murmured quietly, trying to process what they had just heard. The glances, once filled with doubt, now fluctuated between admiration and uncertainty. Ethan's honesty, far from weakening him as Ryan had intended, had strengthened him in the eyes of his colleagues. The air was thick with tension, but something in the atmosphere had changed. Control was no longer entirely in Ryan's hands. Emily, instrumental in Ethan's decision to confess, watched him with a mix of pride and relief. She knew the battle wasn't won yet, but at least Ethan had regained something fundamental, his dignity and the ability to decide his own fate. Now, everything depended on how the board reacted to this new reality. Ryan, for his part, watched with a composed expression, but his eyes betrayed growing frustration. He hadn't anticipated that Ethan would take the initiative, and his plan to expose the past mistakes had been neutralized with a simple confession. He knew he still had a chance, but now he would have to act more carefully. The board was at a crossroads, and any misstep could tilt the balance in Ethan's favor. "It's admirable that you've chosen to be so transparent, Ethan," Ryan finally said, breaking the silence with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But a confession, though brave, doesn't erase the mistakes. The issue here isn't just what happened in the past, but how those mistakes have impacted the company's direction. We can't ignore that these financial slip-ups, although corrected, are a reflection of careless management." Ethan looked at him with serenity. He was no longer willing to cede ground to Ryan's poisonous insinuations. He had made mistakes, yes, but each one had taught him something valuable. And now, faced with an evident betrayal, he knew he had to show the board that his leadership remained crucial to the company's future. "What happened in the past was a miscalculation, Ryan," Ethan responded, his tone firm but without hostility. "But I've learned from those mistakes. And most importantly, I've always prioritized the company's well-being. The risks I took at that time are what brought us to where we are today, in a leading position in the market. I'm not perfect, none of us are. But I know that this company needs stability and experience now more than ever, not a rushed expansion." The board listened attentively. Some nodded, recalling the years of success under Ethan's leadership. Others, though more reserved, seemed to assess his words with newfound respect. The confession had humanized Ethan, reminding them that behind the powerful businessman, there was a man who, despite his physical fragility, had led with determination for decades. Noticing that the narrative was slipping out of his hands, Ryan decided to change tactics. He knew that pressing on past mistakes wouldn't be effective, so he turned to his favorite argument, the need for change. Ethan, no one here questions your past achievements. We all know how much you've done for this company. But as you yourself said, none of us are perfect. He paused, looking at each of the board members, as if inviting them to join his reasoning. We're at a crucial moment. The market won't wait, and our competitors are moving fast. How many more opportunities are we going to let slip by because we're afraid to take risks? The expansion I'm proposing is exactly what we need to stay ahead. It's time to look forward, to think about the future. Ryan spoke with a conviction that resonated in the room. It was his most dangerous skill, manipulating logic to his advantage, presenting his personal interests as the company's interests. Some board members, already influenced by promises of quick profits, looked at him with consideration. Ethan could feel Ryan's words starting to resonate with some of the board members. He knew that while his confession had neutralized the initial attack, Ryan still had influence over several of them. He had to act quickly if he didn't want to lose the trust he had just regained. I agree we need to think about the future, Ethan said, raising his voice slightly to recapture the board's attention. But the future isn't built solely on risks. It's built with vision, strategy, and the kind of knowledge you only gain through experience. He looked at each board member, trying to connect with them personally. I've led this company from its earliest steps, facing far greater crises than this. And I've always made decisions based on what's best for all of us, not just what seems attractive in the short term. Emily watched as Ethan slowly regained his ground. His posture, though still physically fragile, had become more solid, more determined. She knew him well enough to recognize the man who had built an empire, calculated, intelligent, and deeply committed to what he had created. He wasn't the weakened man Ryan tried to portray. He was someone who, despite adversity, hadn't lost his essence. Seeing that Ethan wasn't backing down, Ryan made a drastic decision. He knew he couldn't afford to be subtle anymore. If he wanted to come out victorious in this meeting, he had to strike harder. If we're talking about making decisions for everyone's benefit, Ryan said, pausing for effect, then I believe the board also needs to be aware of another issue. Ryan's gaze hardened as he pulled an envelope from his briefcase. I took the liberty of investigating the company's current finances a bit more thoroughly. And what I found is concerning. Ryan placed the envelope in the center of the table, pushing it forward as if it were a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. The errors Ethan spoke about aren't as much in the past as he led us to believe. Ethan's heart raced. He could feel the tension in the air as everyone turned their eyes toward the envelope. He knew Ryan was about to play his final card, and this time, there was no way to predict what would come. But he couldn't allow fear to control him. Not now. One of the board members, looking worried, took the envelope and began reviewing the documents. The silence in the room grew heavier. Everyone waited for some catastrophic revelation, something that would confirm Ryan's words and undo the control Ethan had worked so hard to regain. After what felt like an eternity, the board member reviewing the papers frowned and looked up. It seems, there are inconsistencies in the company's current balances, he said cautiously, as if not wanting to alarm anyone before confirming the facts. The figures from recent months don't quite match the reports presented to the board. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. The tension in his chest became unbearable. He knew Ryan had been preparing this attack for a long time. He had anticipated everything, down to the smallest discrepancies in the company's finances, using technical or administrative errors to build a case against him. It was a low, dirty blow, but it was effective. Ryan smiled with satisfaction and turned directly to Ethan. As you can see, Ethan, this isn't just about past mistakes. These issues persist and affect the company's viability. His voice was soft but filled with venom. How can we trust the current leadership to take us into the future when they can't even handle the present? The room was thick with tension. Murmurs grew among the board members. Many of them looked at Ethan with a mix of concern and disappointment. Ryan had delivered a devastating blow, and if Ethan didn't respond properly, he could lose control of the company right then and there. Emily, who had been watching the situation unfold with growing anxiety, knew that Ethan was at his physical and emotional limit. But she also knew he wasn't someone who gave up easily. Ethan had the strength to fight, even when everything seemed lost. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to calm his mind. The documents Ryan had presented likely contained errors that, under normal circumstances, could have been easily corrected. However, in this moment, they looked like evidence of poor management. But there was something Ryan hadn't anticipated. Ethan knew his company inside and out. He knew that if he could maintain his composure, he could find a way out. "Ryan, your dedication to this company is undeniable," Ethan finally said, lifting his head with renewed determination. "But if you're truly so concerned about the company's financial health, you should remember that finances aren't static. They adjust, they get reviewed, and they get corrected." He paused, noting how the murmurs in the room quieted. "What you're presenting here isn't a crisis, it's an ongoing process. The inconsistencies in the balances are administrative issues that are already being addressed. And had you consulted the financial team, you would know that we are in the process of rectifying these details. This isn't a crisis, it's part of the daily operations of running a company of this magnitude." The board listened in silence. Ethan's words, though spoken with effort, rang clear. The truth was, every company, even the largest, faced financial adjustments. Ryan had tried to turn an administrative issue into a catastrophe, but Ethan had exposed the reality before it could cause any further harm. "I trust my team, and I trust that any financial issues will be resolved appropriately," Ethan continued. "What I cannot allow is for a normal situation to be used to create panic among us. This company isn't in danger. We've faced worse crises and come out stronger." He paused, looking Ryan directly in the eye. "And I won't allow fear to be the tool that drives our decisions." Ryan, visibly frustrated, didn't respond immediately. He knew his attack had lost momentum. Ethan had managed to regain control of the narrative, turning what seemed like a damaging revelation into a simple administrative inconvenience. The board members exchanged glances, some nodding in approval. Ethan's sincerity and calm had restored confidence in his leadership, and gradually, the sense of panic began to fade. Emily, from her seat, smiled. She knew Ethan had won this round. But she also knew it wasn't over. Ryan might still try something else, but for now, Ethan's leadership remained intact. The atmosphere in the meeting room had shifted after Ethan's final words. The murmurs of the board subsided into an expectant silence as the members processed the reality. What Ryan had presented as a financial catastrophe was, in fact, nothing more than a simple administrative adjustment, something that could happen in any company of that size. Ethan's sincere confession had dispelled the initial doubts, and with his strategic calm, he had once again positioned himself as the leader everyone respected. But the battle wasn't over yet. Ryan, despite his evident frustration, wasn't ready to give up. Seated at the other end of the table, his eyes glimmered with a mixture of restrained anger and desperation. He had played all his cards, but Ethan had skillfully neutralized them one by one, regaining the tacit support of the board members. However, Ryan still had one final opportunity, one last move that could position him as the leader he always believed he was destined to be. For Ryan, this wasn't just business, it was personal. The tension in the room was still thick. Although Ethan had successfully defended his position so far, he knew Ryan wouldn't stay quiet. He knew him well enough to anticipate that the real blow was still to come. and it didn't take long to arrive. Before we conclude this meeting, I think it's important to address one last issue, Ryan said, standing from his seat with a calm that belied the tension in his voice. The board members looked at him with curiosity and a hint of fatigue, expecting what seemed to be his final attempt to wrest control from Ethan. Throughout this meeting, we've discussed leadership, financial errors, and the company's future. But there's one thing we haven't talked about yet. He paused, letting his words sink in. And that's the health of our CEO. Ethan's heart clenched at that moment. He knew exactly where Ryan was going, and while he had anticipated that his physical condition might come up, he hadn't expected it to be brought up in such a calculated manner. Ethan, Ryan said, turning toward him with an expression of feigned concern, everyone here respects you deeply and admires the effort you've put into leading this company even through the toughest times. But I think it's time we ask ourselves if you're truly in a condition to keep carrying the weight of the company on your shoulders. His words were soft, but they dripped with venom. Ryan was using Ethan's physical weakness to undermine his credibility as a leader. The board shifted uncomfortably in their seats. It was a delicate subject, and while many admired Ethan, they couldn't ignore the obvious: his health had visibly declined in recent months. His illness, although handled with dignity, had weakened him considerably. Emily, sitting in her corner, felt a surge of anger. Ryan was attacking Ethan at his most vulnerable point, using a personal matter to manipulate the board. She knew this was a ruthless tactic, but she also knew that Ethan, in his current state, couldn't afford to lose his composure. He had to handle this situation with the same poise he had used against Ryan's earlier attacks. My concern isn't just for you, Ethan, but for the well-being of the company, Ryan continued, his tone more conciliatory now. If you're not in a condition to lead at 100%, we should consider alternatives to ensure the company doesn't suffer the consequences. This isn't a personal attack, it's simply a matter of responsibility to everyone who depends on this company. The attack had been launched. Ryan had succeeded in planting the most dangerous doubt of all: whether Ethan was physically capable of continuing to lead. The board exchanged uncomfortable glances. Some of them had already wondered about it privately, though none had dared to mention it openly. Ethan's health had become a taboo topic, one that many preferred to avoid out of respect, but now, it was at the center of the discussion. Ethan remained silent for a moment, taking a deep breath. He could feel the weight of every gaze upon him, evaluating him, judging whether he was truly strong enough to continue. His body had failed him, but his mind remained intact, sharper than ever. And that was what mattered. Finally, he lifted his head, looking at Ryan with a mix of serenity and defiance. I appreciate your concern, Ryan, Ethan said, his voice firm despite the fatigue weighing him down. But it isn't my physical health that has kept this company going all these years. It's been my commitment, my experience, and my ability to make difficult decisions. He paused, letting his words sink in with the board. Yes, my body isn't what it used to be, that's clear to everyone. But my mind, my vision, and my leadership are as strong as ever. If we're going to judge my ability to lead, let it be based on those merits, not the limitations of my health. Ethan's words echoed in the room like a wake-up call, cutting through the tense atmosphere. The board members looked at him with a mixture of respect and admiration. Despite his physical weakness, Ethan was still the man who had built the company from the ground up, the leader who had taken it to unimaginable heights. And his sincerity, far from weakening him, made him stronger. Ryan, however, wasn't ready to concede. Ethan, I understand what you're saying, and I don't doubt your dedication. But the reality is that leading a company like this requires being at 100%, physically and mentally. And I'm simply not sure you can do that right now. Ryan turned toward the board members, seizing on the doubt that still lingered in the air. For the good of the company, I think we should consider a transitional leadership. Someone who can take over temporarily while Ethan fully recovers. I'm not suggesting you resign, Ethan, just that you take the time you need to take care of yourself. His tone was persuasive, calculated to sound reasonable, almost compassionate. But Ethan and Emily knew it was nothing more than a ploy to push him out of power. Ethan felt the weight of Ryan's words, the insinuation that he was no longer fit to lead. Ryan's proposal wasn't an offer of help, it was a trap designed to slowly erode his control over the company. If he accepted a temporary transition, it would be the beginning of the end for his leadership. The tension was palpable. Ethan looked around at the board members, knowing that many of them were seriously considering Ryan's proposal. After all, logic dictated that a physically weakened leader might not be best for the company's long-term stability. But Ethan hadn't come this far to give up now. Just as Ethan was about to speak, Emily stood up. She couldn't remain silent any longer. She knew her intervention would be unusual, but she also knew that her voice carried weight at this moment. She had been by Ethan's side through the worst times, had seen his internal struggle, and she couldn't let Ryan destroy him. With all due respect, Emily began, her tone firm and controlled, I believe this board needs to remember that a leader's strength isn't measured only by their physical health. Ethan has demonstrated, time and again, that he has the ability to guide this company through difficult times. His vision and his experience are invaluable, and we cannot afford to lose that in such a critical moment. She looked each board member in the eye before turning to Ryan. The transitional leadership you propose may sound reasonable, but let's not fool ourselves. What this company truly needs is stability, not abrupt changes. And Ethan has been, and continues to be, that stability. Emily's intervention took Ryan by surprise. He hadn't expected her, being just Ethan's nurse, to have the courage to speak up like that. But her tone, firm and filled with conviction, resonated deeply in the room. Ethan, deeply grateful for Emily's support, felt a new surge of energy. It was his turn to speak. With renewed calm, he addressed the board once more. I know there are concerns about my health, and I don't ignore them. Ethan spoke with a sincerity that captured everyone's attention. But what Ryan is proposing isn't a solution. Transitional leadership would only create more uncertainty at a time when we need the opposite. I'm willing to do whatever it takes for this company, even if it means delegating some responsibilities to my team. But abandoning leadership isn't an option. Not now. The board listened attentively. The murmurs had ceased, and the atmosphere in the room had shifted once again. Ethan's determination, combined with Emily's unwavering support, had made Ryan's proposal sound increasingly weak, more desperate. The board members, who at first had been receptive to the idea of a transition, now saw that the real risk wasn't in keeping Ethan as leader, but in following Ryan's dangerous strategy. Finally, after a long silence, one of the most senior board members, a man who had stood by Ethan's side for decades, spoke up. Ethan is right, he said firmly. This company has weathered many crises before, and we've always come through thanks to his leadership. I don't think it's wise to change that now. If Ethan believes he can continue to lead, then we need to trust his judgment. His words resonated in the room, and several board members nodded in agreement. Ryan, realizing that his final attempt had failed, remained silent. He knew he had lost. The room was no longer on his side, and any further moves would only make him look worse. Ethan had won, not just the battle for the company, but also the renewed trust of those around him. Ethan, seeing the board's support, felt a deep sense of relief. He had reached his limit, but he hadn't broken. His company, his legacy, remained in his hands. Emily, who had been observing the situation closely, felt immense satisfaction. She had watched Ethan fight, not just against Ryan, but against his own vulnerability. And he had emerged victorious, not as the indestructible man he once was, but as a leader who had learned to embrace his fragility without losing his essence. The meeting concluded shortly after, with a clear message: Ethan remained the undisputed leader of the company, and any attempt to destabilize him had failed. When the room emptied, Ethan remained seated for a moment in silence, gazing out at the horizon through the large windows. He felt the exhaustion in every fiber of his being, but also a deep sense of peace. He had accomplished what many thought impossible, maintaining his leadership at a moment of maximum vulnerability. Emily approached him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You did it," she said with a warm smile. "I knew you could." Ethan looked at her, grateful. He knew he hadn't done it alone. Without Emily, without her support and intuition, perhaps the story would have ended differently. She had been his rock in the hardest moments, and for that, more than anything else, he felt at peace. "I didn't do it alone," Ethan said, returning her smile. "Thank you for being here, Emily. I don't know what I would have done without you." Emily gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze, a silent acknowledgement of what they both knew. It had been a hard battle, but together, they had overcome every obstacle. As the day drew to a close and shadows stretched over the city, Ethan allowed himself a moment of reflection. He had learned something fundamental in those last few days, something he had always avoided facing: vulnerability wasn't a weakness. Embracing his fragility had made him stronger than he could have ever imagined. The future of the company, his company, was still in his hands. And though the road ahead would be long and difficult, he now knew that he didn't have to face it alone. What did you think of this story? If it touched your heart, leave us a comment below and share which part connected most with Ethan and his struggle. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our upcoming stories full of emotion, tough decisions, and characters that will make you feel every moment. By subscribing, you'll stay updated on every new chapter we release, and you can be part of this community that loves powerful stories. Check out the next story we've prepared for you. If you liked this one, you'll love what's next. Click now and let yourself be drawn into another exciting adventure.